This video is brought to you by the Army Painter. The internet hobby sphere understandably talks a lot about painting, but what about building? We're going to scroll all the way back to basics and deal with this topic in a more neophyte approachable way. For the uninitiated, putting together a miniature may seem rather daunting, but don't worry, we're going to use our level best to demystify the process so that you can build with confidence. I'm Keewa. Ordinarily I'd say I'm the resident painter here, but since we won't be pushing any pigment today, perhaps I should call myself the builder instead. To start today's video, we first need to have a short conversation about materials. Yes, that's right, there are various different materials from which our beloved miniatures are made, and it's absolutely vital to understand which material it is that you're dealing with, because like humans, elves, dwarves, orcs, space marines, whatever, you've got to treat them differently. For more tutorials and hobby how-tos, pay a visit to goonhammer.com, like and subscribe here on YouTube, and consider supporting us on Patreon. First up is plastic. The vast majority of consumer miniatures you might get from the shelves of your hobby shop will probably be made from this. They'll typically be on a frame and made by injection molding plastic between steel plates. The exact formulations of each brand's plastics are kept closely guarded, but for all intents and purposes, the plastic is polystyrene. Polystyrene is typically quite hard and somewhat springy. It isn't brittle and pieces bend rather than snapping. Since making plastic miniatures via injection molding requires very expensive machinery and a lot of factory space for mass production, it's only really available to medium and large companies. No one's making plastic kits in their shed. There is another kind of plastic known as soft plastic to distinguish it from the hard plastic of Games Workshop and similar companies. This kind of material, which is used in a lot of board games that use miniatures as part of their concept, in budget miniature lines like Reaper Bones, or even those green plastic army men you used to have in a bucket as a kid. These are all made from soft plastic. Next is resin. Resin production is, at least in many cases, cheaper and more accessible than making miniatures from plastic, so most small to medium businesses will be producing resin rather than plastic miniatures. There are plenty of different types of resin and different ways in which resin miniatures are produced, but for our purpose there are three kinds that we can talk about. The first is Forge World and other high-quality casting resin, from Games Workshop's erstwhile quasi-sister company. This resin is premium high-quality stuff with razor-sharp detail and a price tag to match. It's produced by casting, with liquid resin poured into molds rather than in frames, and it comes attached to these weird trapezoid lumps. If you think of a mold as a negative of the miniature, these lumps are where the resin is poured in from. Next is 3D printer UV resin, which is the sort of thing small companies and home printers can use to make very detailed miniatures from STL files. These are sculpted in 3D rendering programs like Blender. This is the new kid on the block in terms of miniature making material, but it's by far the most accessible for people who want to produce their own miniatures. Last on this list is Finecast. Everyone's least favorite miniature material. Much digital ink has been spilt on the topic of Finecast and why it sucks so much. Long story short, Finecast is a polyurethane resin that our friends at Games Workshop used to use to make miniatures. It's terrible. It feels like it's made from melting down those awful cups you used to have orange juice in at birthday parties. It's very brittle and exceptionally unforgiving to work with. Fortunately for everyone, Games Workshop seems to be phasing out Finecast, with the majority of its Finecast offerings having been replaced by new plastic kits in the last few years. The internet is rife with speculation that Finecast only existed so that Citadel could continue making models using the molds created for metal miniatures, but with a cheaper material. Which brings us to metal. The earliest miniatures in the wargaming sphere were made of metals of various kinds, tin and lead-containing pewter in particular. Since the end of the 1980s, we've cooled quite a lot on the whole having lead around and playing with it thing, so metal Citadel miniatures are made with white metal, which is a catch-all term for lead-free tin alloys. Obviously, the exact materials are still a trade secret, so we don't know, but Games Workshop have at least confirmed that their metal miniatures do not contain any lead. Metal miniatures are cast on a frame in the same way as Finecast, they use the same molds after all. Molten white metal is poured into a mold, and once it's set, the pieces are removed from the frame and packed for shipping. The frame tends not to be included, presumably so the metal can be melted down and reused. Let's start with metal, the elder brother of the materials family. First off, your model is probably covered with odd little bits of flash, these spindly bits that are sometimes folded around and give away where the metal entered the mold to make the piece. Grab a pair of clippers, not your plastic cutters, oh my god, they're not made for it, you will ruin them, and snip the bits of flash away. Once you've done that, take a diamond file and gently smooth out the part until you can't tell where it used to be. Ideally, you should wear some kind of mask for this. You really don't want to inhale little particles of metal, especially if that metal might contain lead. To put the metal together, you'll need to use super glue. You could use epoxy putty, but honestly save yourself the trouble and just use super glue. Just try not to get it on your fingers, your lips, your eyelids, yeah? If your metal model is large, you'll probably need to use a technique called pinning to hold it together, but that's quite complicated, so we'll cover that separately another time. Dry fit the pieces together and make sure they fit snugly, or at least as snugly as you can get them. Then, put some super glue on one of the surfaces and pinch them together with a bit of pressure. Hold on tight, even if your fingertips are hurting from pressing into bare metal, you can do it. Before long, hopefully, your pieces will be nicely adhered to one another. Forge World is a kind of subsidiary of Games Workshop that produces high-quality resin miniatures. First things first, resin is very bad for your lungs. You might think,
"But Keewa, I'm not gonna breathe in my model kit, ha ha ha."
But if you use a file to smooth out pieces, you're producing some very fine resin dust in relative proximity to your face. Dust which you'll probably breathe in, so do yourself a favor, get a respirator mask if you're planning on doing anything with resin. Your lungs will thank you. So to start with, we'll need to wash the pieces in some warm soapy water. Why? Well, in order for the factory to get the model out of the mold once the resin is cured, the molds are smeared with a kind of release agent, a bit like Vaseline or something. Forge World doesn't wash off the release agent before they pack it, so you'll probably have at least some on your resin pieces. You absolutely need to get rid of this because it's hydrophobic. If you leave it on, paint will simply fail to stick to your model at all. One particular quirk of resin is that it can get bent quite easily in the packaging, but this is totally fixable with a bit of know-how. Give yourself a cup of boiling hot water and a cup of cold water. Then what we're going to do is heat up the piece in the hot water until it's malleable and floppy. Often this, combined with gravity, is enough to straighten out the piece. Then, dunk it in the cold water like a medieval blacksmith forging a sword. This will fix the piece the way it is when it gets cold. You may need to do a fair few heat up and rapid cool repetitions before it's perfectly straight, so be patient. Each piece will typically be attached to this sort of trapezoid lump. This handy lump is where the resin is poured into the mold. So use your clippers to cut through the channels and get those pieces off. Once you've done that, you can very carefully slice off any leftovers with a sharp knife before using your diamond file to smooth down the pieces. As with metal, resin needs to go together with cyanoacrylate, superglue. That plastic cement you have from the hobby shop won't work, and if you try, it will damage your resin irreversibly. So do yourself a favor, stick to the superglue. Dry fit the pieces to make sure they go together neatly without leaving any significant gaps. If your resin model is particularly large, you'll probably need to do pinning like I mentioned before. We'll cover that separately another time. Now let's move on to the devil's own material, Finecast. Ugh. In a way, Finecast is similar to Forge World resin, only much, much, much worse. Since Finecast models are cast in the same molds that metal miniatures were cast in, the process is mostly the same, but with a few key differences. Compared to metal, Finecast is both very weak and very brittle. It's very easy for pieces, especially skinny ones like swords and spears, to snap when being handled. Snip the model out of the frame using clippers. Unlike their superior metal cousins, Finecast models are typically still on a frame, presumably to protect them from the rigors of packaging and shipping. Once you've done that, carefully slice off the remaining gates with a sharp hobby knife. Because Finecast is the worst, one of the peg holes to fit Aragorn's horse together is completely filled with resin. Fantastic. To deal with this, we'll use a hobby drill to clean out the excess resin from the hole, and then dry fit and super glue the pieces together. Unfortunately, there's a rather unsightly gap where the horse's head is supposed to join the body, so we'll need to use a bit of green stuff to fill it in, and then scrape off the excess with a sharp hobby knife. My advice to anyone considering getting a Finecast model is, don't. Just don't bother, it's not worth it. See if you can find a metal one instead. Typically, assembling plastic miniatures is a much more laborious process with lots of small pieces that go together in very specific order as outlined in the instructions. Resin and metal miniatures often don't even have any instructions. Start by snipping the pieces off the sprue with some plastic frame cutters. With that done, we'll tidy up the place where the piece meets the frame using a sharp hobby knife and a file if necessary. We'll also look for any mold lines and clean them off by scraping them with the blunt side of the hobby knife blade. Modern kits have become very adept at hiding mold lines in places where you would never ordinarily see them, so this kind of necessity gets less and less as time goes by. But for some older models, you'll probably see some truly egregious mold lines. Cleaning them is the same, just scrape them with the blunt side of the hobby knife. With that done, dry fit the pieces to make sure they do in fact fit together the way they should. Once you're satisfied that the pieces are correct, you have a choice. You can use super glue, or you can also use polystyrene cement, otherwise known as plastic glue. The method and mechanism of action for each is different. Unlike super glue, plastic glue works by melting the pieces together, fusing them into a single part. It usually comes in a bottle with a hollow needle to help you be as accurate as you can with it, or in some cases with a small nail brush style applicator. As a solvent, plastic glue absolutely honks, and sniffing it too much might make you a bit dizzy, among other things, so be careful and use it in a well-ventilated area. Also, if you get some on your finger and then touch the model, you're probably going to leave behind a fingerprint, so be careful, keep it away from your fingertips. Something to consider. Something else to consider is that super glue does not stick to dried super glue. So if you're going to super glue something to something that's already been super glued, you need to scrape the super glue off first. And there you have it, 4 different materials, 4 ways of assembling your miniatures. For more tutorials, hobby how-tos, tactics and more, pay a visit to goonhammer.com, like and subscribe here on YouTube, and consider supporting us on Patreon. I've been Keewa, thank you for watching.